All right, quick question. Can you name all 50 US states without Googling? Be honest. Because statistically, you probably can't. And no, that doesn't make you dumb. It makes you normal. We actually ran a poll. Over 2,500 people were asked to name every single US state from memory. No hints, no maps, no cheating. And what we found was fascinating. Some states, everyone remembers them. California, Texas, Florida, New York. Those states live rent-free in America's head. But other states, they don't get forgotten because they're bad. They get forgotten because they're invisible. They're the states you drive through, not to. The states you experience through a windshield. The states that exist quietly, while America speeds past them at 75 miles an hour. Today, we're counting down the most forgettable states in America, based entirely on real responses. Let's get into it. Number 10, Delaware. Delaware isn't a destination. Delaware is a mistake. You don't plan to visit Delaware. You accidentally end up there while trying to get somewhere else. It's small. It's flat. And it exists mainly as a brief interruption between Pennsylvania and wherever you were actually going. Most Americans know Delaware for exactly 3 things. No sales tax. Corporate paperwork. Joe Biden used to live there. That's it. That's the whole resume. Interstate 95 slices through Delaware like it's late for an appointment. And nobody slows down, because why would they? Yes, Delaware technically has beaches. But even Delaware residents will quietly admit, if we're already driving, we might as well just keep going. Tourism in Delaware is mostly transactional. Gas stop. Bathroom break. Outlet mall if your credit card's feeling reckless. Nobody posts, just arrived in Delaware unless they're being ironic or legally required to be there. Delaware's real superpower is efficiency. You can cross the entire state faster than it takes to pick a podcast. By the time your brain realizes you were in Delaware, you're already out. And honestly, that feels intentional. Delaware isn't forgettable because it's terrible. It's forgettable because it's perfectly invisible. Bar chart: 35% of people forgot Delaware entirely. Number 9, Nebraska. Nebraska doesn't demand attention. It doesn't chase validation. It just exists. And most people experience it the same way, by driving for hours wondering if their GPS froze. Interstate 80 is Nebraska's main attraction. And it's busy, insanely busy. Why? Because it's one of the most important east-west trucking routes in the entire country. Tourists, though, not so much. Most people in Nebraska didn't come for Nebraska. They came through Nebraska, on their way to Colorado, Utah, or literally anywhere with elevation. Cities like Omaha and Lincoln try. And look, they're perfectly fine places to live. But perfectly fine doesn't convince anyone to stop driving and book a hotel. Nebraska teaches patience, endurance, and the true meaning of cruise control. What do you pull over for? A zoo in Omaha, which, to be fair, is one of the best in the country. After that, world's largest ball of twine energy. Tell someone you're vacationing in Nebraska and watch their face react like you just told them you're fasting for fun. Nebraska is the state equivalent of background music in a waiting room. You know it's there, but you couldn't hum it if your life depended on it. Bar chart: 38% forgot Nebraska. Number 8, Kansas. Kansas is Nebraska's slightly louder cousin, and somehow still ignored. Interstate 70 cuts straight through Kansas like a dare. You can literally watch weather systems form in real time here. Clouds age. Time stretches. Billboards advertise towns you will never stop in. Kansas traffic is solid because people want out of Kansas quickly and without comment. Tourism numbers tell the truth. People don't come here unless they have family, business, or an emotional attachment to wheat. The state sells Americana and history, but that pitch only works if you actually turn off your engine. Most drivers don't. They grip the wheel, set cruise control, and swear this is the last time they ever drive cross-country. Kansas feels like a loading screen that never finishes. Not broken, just buffering. It's not bad. It's not ugly. It's just not a destination. Bar chart, 41% forgot Kansas. Number 7, Iowa. Iowa is what happens when a place becomes so stable, so reliable, so consistently fine, that your brain stops bookmarking it. Interstate 80 is packed here. Semi-trucks love it. Families tolerate it. Tourists, they absolutely do not seek it out. If someone ever tells you that I-80 through Iowa is a scenic drive, that person is not your friend. Iowa's problem isn't that it lacks things to see. It's that nothing here feels urgent. No landmark that screams, "Turn off the highway now." No terrain shift that shocks your senses awake. Just clean towns, decent people, fields that stretch longer than some marriages. People pass through Iowa thinking, "Hey, this seems nice." And then they never think about it again. That's not an insult. That is Iowa's brand. Iowa doesn't chase attention. It politely waits for you to leave. It's the state equivalent of a respectful nod. You acknowledge it, then keep walking. Bar chart, 43% of respondents forgot Iowa existed. Number 6, Indiana. Indiana has a geography problem. It sits directly between Chicago and everywhere else people actually want to go. Interstate traffic here is relentless because people are either escaping Chicago, avoiding Chicago, or emotionally recovering from Chicago. Indiana technically has tourism, racing, college sports, a little lakefront, but none of it can compete with the gravitational pull of nearby cities. Most drivers enter Indiana already irritated. They stay irritated through construction zones, and they leave without learning a single thing about the state. Indiana feels temporary, like you've been assigned here, not invited. Even the rest stops give off, "Don't get comfortable" energy. It's not empty. It's transitional. Sure, if you're going for a race or a big basketball game, you'll go there. Motorsports and college basketball matter here. But beyond that, what's pulling you in? Gary. Exactly. Bar chart, 44% forgot Indiana. Number 5, Wyoming. Wyoming is massive, beautiful, and somehow still forgettable to most Americans. Why? Because almost nobody lives there. And most people don't stop long enough to remember it. Traffic is lighter than the Midwest, but the pass-through ratio is still high. People cross Wyoming to get to Yellowstone, Jackson, or a lodge with a gift shop. They don't stop in Wyoming. They stop at the idea of Wyoming. Outside the national parks, the state disappears fast. Long roads, sparse towns, a silence that makes some drivers uncomfortable. Wyoming doesn't entertain you. It dares you to slow down. And most people refuse. Now, none of this is an insult to Wyoming residents. That's exactly how they like it. In fact, if they're listening to this right now, they're probably nodding along thinking, "Yes, please stop talking about us." Wyoming has an ongoing joke that it's not even real, that it doesn't exist, that it's a myth. Honestly, that might be the most effective tourism strategy of all time. Bar chart, 47% forgot Wyoming. Number 4, South Dakota. South Dakota is proof that having one iconic thing can actually hurt you. Because South Dakota's entire national identity is basically backhand index pointing right one mountain, backhand index pointing right, and one motorcycle rally. That's it. Mount Rushmore carries this state on its back like an exhausted employee who never got a raise. People don't visit South Dakota. They swing by it. They take the photo. They buy the magnet. They nod respectfully. And then they leave. Interstate traffic is steady because it connects the northern plains. But very few people linger. Most travelers have the same internal dialogue. Okay, cool, got it. And then they're back in the car. What's fascinating is how recognizable South Dakota is, and how little anyone can actually say about it. Ask someone what they know. Oh yeah, Mount Rushmore. Ask them anything else. Silence. Buffering. Mental loading screen. Half the time, people don't even know what state Mount Rushmore is in. They just know the picture. The heads. The vibes. If they've watched Deadwood on HBO, they might feel confident for a second. But even then, it's more about the show than the state. South Dakota is familiar without being known. Visible without being memorable. It's like seeing someone every day at the gym, but having no idea what their name is. Bar chart: 49% of respondents forgot South Dakota. Number 3, Arkansas. Arkansas might be the most misunderstood state on this entire list. Because here's the truth. Arkansas is beautiful. Mountains, rivers, forests, scenery that has no business being this underrated. And yet, it remains one of the most driven through, least talked about states in America. Interstates funnel traffic north-south and east-west. And drivers almost never exit unless absolutely necessary. Tourism exists here, but it's quiet. Regional. Overshadowed by louder neighbors with bigger marketing budgets and flashier reputations. Arkansas is the kind of place people discover accidentally. They're driving. They get tired. They pull off. And suddenly they're like, wait, why didn't anyone tell us about this? And then they don't tell anyone else. It's like a secret you forget you're keeping. Arkansas isn't forgettable because it lacks value. It's forgettable because no one told America to stop and look. And that's wild, because if Arkansas leaned hard into tourism, if they marketed the scenery, the rivers, the outdoor life, they'd dominate. But they don't. So the state just sits there quietly, letting cars pass. I've spent time in Arkansas, and every time I leave, I think, this place should be way more famous than it is. Bar chart: 49% forgot Arkansas. Number 2, Missouri. Missouri is the ultimate, I know that, wait, where is that, state. Because here's the weird part. People know St. Louis. People know Kansas City. But ask them what state those cities are in. Blank stare. Missouri's tourism footprint is heavily concentrated. St. Louis, Kansas City, Lake of the Ozarks. Outside of that, the state becomes infrastructure. Farmland, rest stops, exit signs that sound familiar but don't spark memory. Missouri feels like a place that exists to support movement, not to interrupt it. Its roads, its connections, its logistics. And look, those things matter. They're essential, but they're not memorable. If you're not from Missouri or a neighboring state, ask yourself honestly. Besides St. Louis and Kansas City, what do you know about Missouri? Exactly. Missouri isn't ignored. It's bypassed. Bar chart: 53% forgot Missouri. Kentucky is one of those states that everyone thinks they understand until you ask them to explain it, and then suddenly the room gets quiet. People will confidently say, oh yeah, Kentucky, and then their brain immediately jumps to 3 things: bourbon, horses, and that one time they drove through it at night on the way to Florida. And that's the entire relationship most Americans have with Kentucky. Not hatred, not love, just motion. Kentucky is movement. Kentucky is passing through. Kentucky is the state equivalent of the song playing on the radio that you don't hate, you don't love, but you absolutely do not remember 5 minutes later. And that is exactly how a state ends up being forgotten by 61% of people in a survey, despite being physically impossible to avoid if you travel the eastern half of the country. Kentucky sits in one of the most important geographic positions in the United States, and almost nobody talks about that. This state is a crossroads, whether it wants to be or not. The Midwest, the South, Appalachia, and the Ohio Valley all collide here like awkward strangers at a gas station. Interstates slice through Kentucky like arteries. I-75 dragging traffic from Michigan and Ohio straight down to Georgia and Florida. I-64 connecting the Midwest to the East Coast. I-65 funneling people between Chicago, Nashville, and the Deep South. Millions of people pass through Kentucky every single year without ever mentally arriving. They see hills, trees, road signs, maybe a Buc-ee's detour if they're lucky. And then they're gone. Ha ha ha. Kentucky doesn't wave. It just lets you leave. And that's the funny thing. Kentucky isn't empty. It isn't boring. It isn't even lacking identity. It's overloaded with identity. The problem is that none of it screams for attention. Kentucky doesn't jump into your face. It doesn't brand itself loudly. It doesn't shove a skyline at you or slap a slogan on every billboard saying, "Look at me." Instead, Kentucky just exists, confidently, stubbornly, quietly, like someone who knows exactly who they are and doesn't feel the need to explain it to strangers driving 75 miles an hour with cruise control on. Ha ha ha. That's not great for memorability, but it is extremely Kentucky. If you actually stop in Kentucky, like really stop, not just pull over for gas and a bathroom, the state slowly reveals itself in layers. And those layers are weird, and charming, and contradictory. Kentucky is rural and urban at the same time. It's old money and broke money. It's tradition and improvisation. It's people who will talk your ear off and people who won't say a word for 10 minutes but will help you anyway. It's Appalachian culture bleeding into Midwestern practicality, with Southern hospitality sprinkled on top like seasoning you didn't ask for, but somehow needed. And none of that translates well through a windshield. Historically, Kentucky has always been caught between identities. It was technically a border state during the Civil War, which means it carries a complicated legacy that never fully picked a side and never fully escaped the tension. That indecision still shows up today, culturally and politically. Kentucky doesn't behave like a clean stereotype. It confuses people. It doesn't fit neatly into the mental map Americans like to use. Is it Southern? Kind of. Is it Midwestern? Sometimes. Is it Appalachian? In parts. Is it rural? Yes. Is it urban? Also yes. Louisville feels nothing like Eastern Kentucky. Lexington feels nothing like Paducah. And none of them feel like the version of Kentucky people think they already know. And then there's Bourbon. Oh, Bourbon. The thing everyone thinks they know about Kentucky, but almost nobody understands beyond, whiskey. Bourbon is not just a product here. It's infrastructure, it's history, it's law, it's agriculture, it's water chemistry, it's limestone, it's time. You don't rush Bourbon, and Kentucky doesn't rush anything either, which is probably not a coincidence. Bourbon barrels literally sit for years doing nothing visible, and Kentucky seems to operate the same way. From the outside, it looks like nothing's happening. From the inside, everything is happening slowly, deliberately, and with a long memory. Horse racing is the same story. People hear Kentucky Derby and think hats and mint juleps and 2 minutes of excitement once a year. What they don't think about is how deeply horses are woven into the economy, the land use, the culture, the identity. Entire regions revolve around breeding, training, and maintaining animals that most Americans only see on TV once and then forget about. Kentucky doesn't forget. Kentucky remembers everything. It remembers land. It remembers families. It remembers who used to own what. It remembers grudges. It remembers favors. And that long memory doesn't translate well to tourists who just want a highlight reel. Eastern Kentucky tells a completely different story, and this is where the forgettability becomes almost tragic. Appalachia in Kentucky is some of the most misunderstood land in America. People think poverty and stop thinking. They don't think about music, storytelling, resilience, humor, intelligence, or the insane adaptability required to survive in areas that have been economically neglected for generations. Coal shaped this region and then abandoned it, and the scars are still visible if you know what you're looking at. But again, you have to stop. You have to look. And America doesn't stop in Kentucky. Ha ha ha, Louisville tries. Louisville really tries. It's a city with personality, food, culture, art, sports, history, and it still gets overshadowed because it sits next to Cincinnati, which most people mentally remember more easily. And half the time, people see Cincinnati from Kentucky and think they've arrived somewhere else entirely. That's how invisible Kentucky can be. You can be standing in it and still think you're somewhere else. Lexington is beautiful, educated, horse-obsessed, quietly wealthy in places, and still somehow absent from the national conversation. Frankfurt is the capital, and almost nobody outside the state could point to it on a map without cheating. Smaller towns are full of stories that never make the news. Floods, tornadoes, economic shifts, opioid crises, rebuilding efforts, community resilience, all happening quietly repeatedly, without cameras staying long enough to care. Kentucky's biggest mistake, if you can even call it that, is that it never demanded attention. It never forced itself into the national imagination the way other states did. Florida is loud. Texas is loud. California is loud. Kentucky just kept doing Kentucky things, assuming people would notice eventually. And instead, America drove through it, glanced at the hills, and forgot the name of the place they were just in. And that's how you end up with a state that 61% of people couldn't remember in a survey, even though millions of them had physically been there. This isn't a failure of Kentucky. It's a failure of how America remembers things. Loud beats deep, flashy beats layered, quick beats slow, and Kentucky is slow, purposefully slow, almost stubbornly slow, like it's daring you to stop rushing and pay attention. Most people don't. Kentucky also has this strange relationship with time that most people don't notice unless they live there or spend enough days letting the place sink into their bones. Time in Kentucky doesn't rush you, and it doesn't apologize for that. Things open when they open. Conversations end when they end. Decisions are made after people have sat with them for a while. This drives outsiders insane. Ha ha ha. People used to cities show up expecting efficiency, expecting urgency, expecting someone to clap their hands and say, "All right, let's go." Kentucky just looks back like, "We are going, we've been going, you're just late to the pace." And that pace is slow enough to notice details most places bulldoze over. The way the land rolls instead of spikes. The way fog hangs in the valleys in the morning like the state is half asleep and doesn't want to wake up yet. The way conversations start about the weather and end 3 topics later with family history, local gossip, and an unsolicited life lesson you didn't ask for but somehow needed. Ha ha ha. Food in Kentucky tells the same story. People think fried chicken and stop there. And yes, fried chicken matters. But that's like saying Paris is about bread and stopping the sentence. Kentucky food is survival food turned comfort food turned tradition. It's recipes that existed before measurements were written down. It's cooking that assumes you're feeding more people than you planned for because someone's cousin showed up unannounced. It's food that's meant to sit on the table and wait for you, not impress you for Instagram. And again, none of this translates when you're just passing through and grabbing fast food off an exit ramp. You don't taste Kentucky at 70 miles an hour. The people are the biggest contradiction of all. Kentucky produces some of the toughest, most self-reliant people you'll ever meet, and at the same time some of the warmest, most generous. That combination confuses outsiders. People expect kindness to be soft. It's not. Kentucky kindness is practical. I'll help you change that tire kindness, not thoughts and prayers kindness. It's you can stay here tonight kindness without a long emotional speech attached. And then, once the help is done, there's no follow-up. No bragging, no reminder. Just a nod and life moves on. That doesn't stick in people's memory the way spectacle does. Kentucky also gets unfairly flattened in national conversations. When people talk about the state, they tend to talk about it as if it's one place with one personality. That's laughable if you've spent any time there. Eastern Kentucky feels like a different country compared to Western Kentucky. Northern Kentucky has its own rhythm entirely because of its proximity to Ohio. Louisville has its own identity crisis because it wants to be a big city without losing its regional soul. Lexington quietly minds its business, surrounded by horse farms that look like money but don't act flashy about it. And rural Kentucky exists in hundreds of variations that never make it into headlines because headlines don't care about normal, functional lives. Economically, Kentucky has always been underestimated. It's been treated as a resource state, a pass-through state, a labor state, but rarely as a place of innovation or complexity. And yet, quietly, Kentucky has been producing artists, athletes, writers, musicians, engineers, and thinkers who leave, succeed elsewhere, and then get labeled as coming from somewhere else. Ha ha ha. People will claim them once they're famous, but nobody paid attention while they were still here. That's a recurring theme. Even the jokes about Kentucky tell you something. The stereotypes are old, lazy, and repeated by people who have never actually been there. And Kentuckians know this. They hear it, they roll their eyes, and then they keep living their lives. There's a resilience there that doesn't perform for outsiders. It doesn't argue back loudly. It doesn't demand correction. It just keeps going, which again is terrible for memorability and great for survival. Kentucky's relationship with hardship is also different. Hardship isn't a story here, it's a condition. Floods happen, industries collapse, jobs disappear, communities adapt, people help each other, then life continues. There's no dramatic pause, no national spotlight staying long enough to understand the recovery. Kentucky absorbs shock and keeps moving, which ironically makes it easier for the rest of the country to forget it. Until the next crisis, headline flashes for 5 seconds and disappears. And here's the part that really seals Kentucky's fate as the most forgotten state. It doesn't interrupt you. It doesn't force you to remember it. When you drive through Kentucky, nothing jumps out and yells, "Stop here or you're missing everything." Instead, the state assumes you're capable of curiosity. It assumes you'll pull over if you want to know more. America, statistically speaking, does not pull over. Ha ha ha. That's why Kentucky ends up as a corridor in people's minds. A middle, a transition, a between. People remember where they started and where they ended. They forget the place that quietly carried them from one to the other. And Kentucky carries a lot of people, all the time, without asking for credit. There's also something deeply ironic about Kentucky being forgotten while being so foundational. So much of what people romanticize about real America lives here. Land, labor, tradition, family, routine, endurance. But because it's not packaged loudly, it gets overlooked. Kentucky doesn't sell you a fantasy. It offers you reality, and reality is harder to market. If Kentucky wanted to be remembered more, it could. It could brand itself harder. It could shout louder. It could simplify itself into a stereotype and lean into it. But doing that would break something essential about the place. And Kentucky knows that, even if it never says it out loud. So it stays what it is. A place that works. A place that holds. A place that doesn't chase attention. And that's why, when asked to name all 50 states, so many people pause, squint, and eventually miss Kentucky entirely, even though they've been there, even though they've driven those roads, even though they've seen those hills. They were there. They just weren't paying attention. And here, where Kentucky quietly flips the whole zero to hero idea on its head, because Kentucky was never trying to be the hero in the first place. Heroes want applause. Heroes want recognition. Heroes want their moment. Kentucky is more like the person who shows up early, does the work, cleans up afterward, and leaves before anyone thinks to say thank you. Ha ha ha. And somehow, that becomes the most Kentucky thing imaginable. This state doesn't chase the spotlight because historically, the spotlight hasn't been kind to it. When attention comes, it usually comes attached to a problem, a stereotype, or a headline that leaves out more than it explains. So Kentucky learned a long time ago that survival doesn't come from being seen, it comes from being steady. That steadiness shows up everywhere once you start noticing it. In how towns rebuild after floods without waiting for permission. In how families stretch resources and make things last longer than they should. In how people take pride in knowing how to fix things themselves because assuming help is coming is a luxury. This isn't romantic hardship. It's practical. It's learned. It's passed down quietly. And again, none of this plays well on a national stage that prefers quick stories with clear villains and heroes. Kentucky stories are long, messy, unfinished. They don't wrap up neatly in a news segment, so they get skipped. There's also a deep humor here that outsiders rarely catch because it's subtle and dry and sometimes brutal in its honesty. Kentucky humor doesn't beg for laughs. It just drops a line and moves on, trusting that if you got it, you got it. And if you didn't, that's on you. Ha ha ha. That kind of humor doesn't translate well to people who expect punchlines and applause breaks. It lives in timing, pauses, and understatement. It lives in saying less, not more. Which, again, makes Kentucky harder to remember if you're not listening closely. Education is another area where Kentucky quietly defies expectations. People assume ignorance because it's easier than understanding nuance. But Kentucky produces thinkers who know how to navigate complexity because they grew up in it. They understand systems because they've seen how fragile systems can be. They understand community because isolation forces cooperation. They understand consequence because mistakes here aren't theoretical. And many of those people leave, not because they hate Kentucky, but because opportunity pulls harder elsewhere. When they succeed, their origin becomes a footnote instead of a headline. Music alone could carry an entire conversation. Kentucky sits at a crossroads of sound the same way it sits at a crossroads of geography. Bluegrass, country, gospel, Appalachian folk, blues influence, all blending, all evolving, all taken for granted locally and misunderstood nationally. This isn't museum music, it's living music. It changes, it adapts, it gets passed down imperfectly. And because it doesn't arrive with fireworks, people forget where it came from. They remember the song. They forget the place. Even Kentucky's politics reflect its identity confusion. It doesn't fit clean narratives. It doesn't vote or behave the way people expect based on stereotypes. And instead of examining why, outsiders just throw up their hands and move on. Complexity is inconvenient. Kentucky is complex. Therefore, Kentucky is skipped. Ha ha ha. And let's talk about land, because Kentucky land is deceptive. It doesn't look dramatic from a distance. It rolls, it folds, it hides. The beauty here reveals itself slowly, like a story you don't appreciate until you're halfway through and realize you've been paying attention without meaning to. It's not postcard loud. It's memory quiet. And if you don't stop long enough to let it work on you, it won't. Kentucky doesn't perform for drive-bys. The irony is that Kentucky has influenced American identity far more than America remembers. Labor movements, music, foodways, military service, migration patterns. The state has fed cities, staffed factories, powered industries, and filled highways for decades. And in return, it got reduced to a punchline or ignored entirely. That would make some places bitter. Kentucky mostly shrugs. You can't disappoint someone who never promised you anything. And that's the real reason Kentucky becomes the most forgotten state in surveys like this. Forgetting isn't always about absence. Sometimes it's about presence that doesn't demand acknowledgement. Kentucky doesn't interrupt your life. It supports it quietly. And when the moment passes, you remember the destination, not the ground that carried you there. People think zero to hero means transformation. Kentucky's story is endurance. It didn't become something else to survive. It stayed itself. That's not flashy, that's not viral, but it's rare. So when 61% of people forget Kentucky's name, what they're really forgetting is the space between moments. The middle of the journey, the place that didn't shout, the place that didn't rush, the place that didn't ask you to remember it. And Kentucky is fine with that. It always has been. Kentucky also exists in a strange emotional position inside the American mind, because it's familiar without being specific. People feel like they know it, even when they don't. They've seen it in passing shots in movies, in background hills on road trip vlogs, in quick aerial clips that exist to transition between somewhere important and somewhere else important. That false familiarity makes the state easier to forget. If your brain thinks it already understands something, it stops recording new details. Ha ha ha. Kentucky becomes mental wallpaper, always there, never examined. And when you do stop examining it, you realize how many contradictions live side by side here without making noise. Old and new, proud and tired, hopeful and realistic, tradition and reinvention sharing the same table without arguing about it. Kentucky doesn't frame these contradictions as problems. They're just facts. You don't resolve them. You work around them. That mindset shapes everything from business to family to how people talk about the future. Big promises sound suspicious here. Small improvements are trusted. People underestimate Kentucky's cities because they expect rural stereotypes everywhere. Louisville alone breaks half of the assumptions outsiders bring. It's artsy, layered, stubbornly local, and allergic to being compared to anywhere else. It doesn't want to be Nashville. It doesn't want to be Cincinnati. It doesn't even fully want to represent Kentucky to outsiders. It just exists, doing its own thing, quietly shaping culture while people elsewhere argue about trends. Lexington, Bowling Green, Paducah, all doing versions of the same thing, building lives without asking for validation. Then there's the Appalachian side of Kentucky, which gets flattened into caricature more than almost any region in the country. Outsiders treat it like a time capsule, frozen in hardship, when in reality it's constantly adapting. People here innovate out of necessity. They reuse, repurpose, reimagine. They understand systems because they've been excluded from them. That produces a kind of intelligence that doesn't show up in resumes or headlines. It shows up in survival. It shows up in knowing what actually matters when resources are limited. And yes, coal hangs over Kentucky's identity like a shadow that never fully leaves. But the lazy version of that story ignores the human complexity underneath. Coal wasn't just an industry. It was a promise. A deal people made with danger in exchange for stability. When that deal collapsed, the narrative moved on. Kentucky stayed behind to deal with the consequences. That's another reason people forget it. Nobody likes remembering unfinished business. Food tells you everything if you pay attention. Kentucky food isn't flashy. It's filling, it's functional, it's about feeding people, not impressing them. You'll find dishes built for long days, shared tables, and limited waste. Recipes get passed down without measurements because precision wasn't the point. Adaptability was. You use what you have. You don't apologize for it. Ha ha ha. That attitude shapes more than kitchens. It shapes lives. Sports loyalty here borders on identity. College basketball isn't entertainment. It's inheritance. You don't pick a side. You're born into one. And that loyalty carries a deeper meaning. In places where opportunity feels uncertain, collective pride matters more. Teams become symbols of consistency. Something that shows up when other things don't. That emotional investment gets mocked from the outside, but it's rooted in something very real. Kentucky's relationship with faith is similar. Less performative than people expect. More woven into daily life than broadcasted. It's not about spectacle, it's about structure. Community, shared responsibility. When disasters hit, churches don't post statements. They unlock doors, they cook, they organize. Again, none of this trends online, so it disappears from national memory as soon as it happens. Even Kentucky's roads tell a story. Curving, folding, refusing straight lines. You don't blast through them at full speed unless you want to end your day early. They force you to pay attention, to slow down, to adjust. That's a metaphor so obvious it almost feels unfair to say out loud. But it's real. Kentucky doesn't reward rushing. It rewards awareness. And that brings us back to why Kentucky ends up #1 on forgettable lists. Not because it lacks identity, but because its identity doesn't translate to quick consumption. Kentucky doesn't explain itself. It doesn't summarize well. It doesn't fit into a caption. You have to experience it long enough to feel it. And most people never do. They drive through, they glance, they move on. And later, when someone asks them to name all 50 states, Kentucky floats just outside recall. Not gone, just quiet. And honestly, Kentucky wouldn't correct you. Kentucky also carries a strange kind of dignity that doesn't announce itself. It's the dignity of a place that has been misunderstood for so long that it stopped trying to correct the record. When you're constantly reduced to stereotypes, you either perform for the camera or you turn the camera off. Kentucky chose the second option. That choice makes it invisible in national conversations, but it also makes it resilient. There's a freedom in not being watched closely. You experiment quietly. You fail privately. You rebuild without an audience. Ha ha ha. Education here is another example of quiet complexity. Outsiders assume lack of ambition, but that assumption collapses the moment you look at how seriously people treat learning when resources are scarce. When something is not guaranteed, it becomes precious. Teachers wear multiple hats. Schools double as community centers. Knowledge isn't abstract here. It's practical. It's about how to get out, how to stay, how to improve life without leaving it behind. Kentucky produces people who know how to adapt to systems that weren't designed for them. And that skill travels far even when the credit doesn't. Healthcare tells a similar story. Challenges are real, outcomes are uneven, but so is the ingenuity that fills the gaps. Clinics become lifelines, neighbors become transportation networks, families become care teams. The national narrative zooms in on the statistics and zooms out before seeing the human infrastructure that compensates for them. That infrastructure doesn't show up on maps, but it's there, stronger than people think. Kentucky's economy doesn't move in headlines either. It hums. Manufacturing, logistics, agriculture, bourbon, healthcare, education. None of it glamorous enough to dominate the news cycle, all of it essential enough to keep things running. Louisville's logistics hubs quietly move enormous portions of the country's packages while people argue online about innovation elsewhere. Bourbon tourism gets the attention, but the real story is how tradition became an export without losing its soul. That balance is rare. Most places either freeze tradition or sell it out. Kentucky threads the needle, slowly, stubbornly. And then there's the humor, dry, self-aware, defensive but warm once you get past the first layer. Kentuckians joke about themselves before anyone else can. That's not insecurity, that's control. If you own the joke, it can't be used against you. You hear it in conversations, in local radio, in family gatherings. Laughter here isn't loud. It's knowing. It's the kind that says, yeah, we know exactly how this looks. Ha ha ha. Music floats through Kentucky in unexpected ways. Bluegrass, yes, but also rock, hip-hop, folk, experimental sounds that don't fit the postcard image. Artists grow up absorbing multiple worlds at once. Church music on Sunday. Radio hits on the drive. Local bands in basements. That collision creates voices that don't sound like anywhere else. Again, they don't always break through nationally, but they influence quietly, feeding scenes elsewhere without demanding credit. The land itself refuses to be simplified. Western Kentucky feels nothing like Eastern Kentucky. The horse farms don't resemble the coal hills. The river towns live on a different rhythm than the mountain hollers. Calling it one thing misses the point. Kentucky isn't a single identity. It's a collection of micro-worlds that tolerate each other without trying to merge. That tolerance looks like indifference from the outside. It's actually respect. Politics here get flattened too. Outsiders treat Kentucky as a monolith, but anyone who's spent time here knows it's a patchwork of contradictions. Progressive pockets, deep conservatism, pragmatic centrists, people who vote one way nationally and another locally. The common thread isn't ideology, it's skepticism. Big promises are met with raised eyebrows. Trust is earned slowly. That makes Kentucky frustrating to campaign in and easy to misunderstand afterward. History runs deep, but it doesn't sit in museums alone. It sits in speech patterns, family names, property lines, grudges, alliances. The past isn't romanticized as much as it's managed. People know where they came from. They don't always agree on what it means. That tension keeps the culture alive instead of embalmed. So when Kentucky ends up labeled forgettable, it's almost funny. Because forgetting usually means something didn't register. Kentucky registers. It just doesn't linger unless you let it. It doesn't chase you down. It doesn't demand remembrance. It waits to see if you're paying attention. And if you're not, that's fine too. Kentucky will still be there tomorrow, still working, still adapting, still quietly shaping people who leave and people who stay, still existing between destinations, between narratives, between expectations. That's not forgettable. That's just unbothered. There's also something deeply American about Kentucky's invisibility, because the country itself was built on places like this doing the work, while louder places took the spotlight. Kentucky sits right in that tension. It's central but not celebrated, necessary but not glamorized. When people talk about real America, they usually mean a vague idea that borrows heavily from Kentucky without nomming it. The farms, the back roads, the work ethic, the sense of minding your own business until something actually matters. Kentucky lives inside that phrase while rarely being acknowledged by it. Ha ha ha. Generational memory here operates differently. In fast-moving cities, people measure time by trends. In Kentucky, time is measured by people. Who owned the land before? Who worked where? Who left and who came back? That creates a long memory that doesn't always align with national narratives about progress. Progress here isn't about speed. It's about stability. It's about whether the next generation has a slightly better shot than the last. That sounds small, until you realize how hard that is to achieve without fanfare or investment. There's also the phenomenon of people leaving Kentucky and carrying it with them without realizing it. You see it everywhere, in how they talk, in how they value loyalty, in how they react to arrogance. Kentucky teaches people early that confidence and loudness are not the same thing. You don't impress people by talking big. You impress them by showing up again. That lesson follows Kentuckians into boardrooms, job sites, studios, locker rooms. The state's influence spreads outward through people, not branding. Disaster response reveals character better than marketing ever could. Floods, tornadoes, economic collapse, industry withdrawal. Kentucky has experienced all of it repeatedly. The response pattern is consistent. Immediate action, minimal complaining, no waiting for permission. People don't ask who's responsible. They ask who needs help. That doesn't mean anger doesn't exist. It does. It just waits its turn. Survival comes first. Accountability comes later. That priority ordering confuses outsiders who expect outrage before action. Even Kentucky's relationship with outsiders is layered. There's politeness, but it's observational. People are welcoming, but they're watching, not in a hostile way, in a curious way. They're figuring out who you are, not who you say you are. Once you pass that test, the welcome deepens. You're not a guest anymore. You're included. That transition is subtle and easy to miss, which is why some people leave thinking they were never fully let in. They were. They just didn't notice. The arts here don't shout either. They simmer. Writers, painters, filmmakers, craftsmen, many operate below the national radar, building bodies of work instead of chasing virality. Kentucky produces storytellers who focus on texture, not spectacle. Mood, not climax. That doesn't always translate to mass appeal, but it leaves a mark on those who encounter it. You do quote it immediately. You think about it later. Even the famous parts of Kentucky get misunderstood. Bourbon, for example, isn't about drinking. It's about process, patience, consistency, environment, time doing its work without interference. That philosophy mirrors the state itself. You can't rush bourbon. You can't shortcut Kentucky. You either respect the process or you get something hollow. And maybe that's the real reason Kentucky becomes forgettable in surveys. Modern memory is optimized for speed, for extremes, for contrast. Kentucky lives in the middle. Not the middle as in bland, but the middle as in connective tissue. The space between coasts, the bridge between regions, the pause between destinations. We don't remember pauses, we rush through them. But pauses are where reflection happens, where decisions settle, where momentum is recalibrated. Kentucky exists in that pause, doing work that doesn't look dramatic until you remove it and realize everything starts wobbling. So when people laugh and say, "Yeah, I forgot Kentucky," it lands differently if you've spent time there. It doesn't sound insulting. It sounds expected, almost appropriate. Kentucky never asked to be remembered that way. It asked to be useful. It asked to be steady. It asked to be left alone enough to keep being itself. And in a country obsessed with being seen, that might be the most radical identity of all. Kentucky's modern reinvention is happening in fragments, not waves, and that makes it hard to notice unless you're looking for it. There's no single headline that captures it. No rebrand slogan. No next big thing moment. Instead, it's 1,000 small adjustments made by people who assume no one is watching. Old warehouses becoming studios. Former mining towns experimenting with remote work hubs. Local farms shifting to niche markets. None of it flashy, all of it intentional. Ha ha ha. This slow reinvention frustrates outsiders who expect either collapse or transformation, nothing in between. Kentucky refuses both narratives. It doesn't collapse loudly enough to become a national emergency, and it doesn't transform fast enough to become inspirational clickbait. So it gets skipped. Meanwhile, life continues. Bills get paid. Kids graduate. Businesses open and close and open again under new names. That continuity is boring to observe and powerful to live inside. There's also the myth that Kentucky lacks ambition. That myth survives because ambition here doesn't always mean leaving. In many places, success is measured by escape velocity. Kentucky complicates that idea. Staying can be a choice, not a failure. Improving a place instead of abandoning it takes a different kind of ambition, one that doesn't come with applause. That ambition builds infrastructure instead of resumes. It invests in people who might never trend online. That makes it invisible to metrics obsessed with scale instead of depth. Language itself behaves differently here. People speak economically, not because they have nothing to say, but because words are treated as tools, not decorations. Overstatement triggers suspicion. Understatement builds trust. You'll hear phrases that sound casual but carry weight if you know how to listen. Promises are rare. Commitments are implied. When someone says, "I'll see what I can do," that's not dismissal. That's engagement. Ha ha ha. Kentucky's youth live in tension between pride and pressure. Pride in where they're from, pressure to explain it. They grow up absorbing jokes about their accent, their politics, their prospects. Some internalize it, some reject it, most negotiate it. That negotiation creates sharp awareness. You learn early how to code switch, how to move between worlds, how to let assumptions slide when correcting them costs too much energy. That adaptability shows up later in surprising ways. The state's relationship with technology is misunderstood too. Adoption isn't uniform, but creativity thrives where constraints exist. Limited access forces problem solving. Communities build informal networks. Skills spread peer-to-peer. Innovation doesn't announce itself as innovation. It shows up as "this works better." Again, that doesn't photograph well, so it gets missed. Migration patterns tell another quiet story. Kentucky sends people out, but it also pulls people back. Often later, often with experience, often with a desire to contribute rather than conquer. Return migration doesn't make headlines, but it reshapes places slowly. People bring new expectations home, better standards, broader perspectives, and they blend them with local realities instead of replacing them. That blending creates friction, but also growth. Even Kentucky's relationship with failure is distinct. Failure isn't romanticized, but it's normalized. Things don't always work. Industries decline, projects stall. People adapt without rewriting their identity around it. That resilience looks like apathy from the outside. It's not. It's emotional efficiency. You don't dwell, you adjust. There's an irony here that never gets discussed. Kentucky is forgettable because it's stable enough not to shock and complex enough not to simplify. Extremes stick in memory. Balance fades. That's not a flaw, it's a function. Kentucky absorbs pressure from multiple directions without cracking dramatically. It distributes impact. It smooths transitions. In systems thinking, that role is essential. In storytelling, it's ignored. So when surveys rank Kentucky as forgotten, it reveals more about how memory works than about the state itself. Memory favors spectacle. Kentucky offers substance. Memory loves disruption. Kentucky specializes in continuity. Memory wants symbols. Kentucky operates as context. And context is always overlooked until it's gone. If Kentucky disappeared tomorrow, people wouldn't immediately know what was missing. They'd just feel things stop lining up. Roots would break. Supply chains would stutter. Cultural references would feel thinner. A certain steadiness would vanish. Only then would people start asking questions. Only then would memory sharpen. But Kentucky isn't going anywhere. It doesn't need recognition to persist. It doesn't need validation to function. It has survived being overlooked for generations. It has learned how to turn neglect into autonomy. And maybe that's the final twist. Kentucky isn't forgettable because it failed to stand out. It's forgettable because it succeeded at something most places never attempt, existing without needing to be noticed. And it's perfectly fine with that. There's a psychological comfort in places like Kentucky that rarely gets named because comfort doesn't sell well. Kentucky doesn't overload the senses. It doesn't demand constant reaction. It gives people room to think, to recalibrate, to exist without performing. In a country that increasingly rewards visibility over substance, that quiet becomes a kind of resistance. Not loud resistance, passive resistance. The kind that doesn't argue with the system, just refuses to be consumed by it. This is why people often misread Kentucky's pace as stagnation. They confuse stillness with inactivity. but stillness is often where the most durable decisions get made. Kentucky's changes happen under the surface. By the time they're visible, they've already been tested, already been lived with, already been adjusted. That makes them harder to reverse and less exciting to report on. Slow change doesn't trend, it lasts. There's also an emotional realism here that clashes with America's obsession with optimism. Kentucky doesn't pretend everything will be okay just because someone wants it to be. Hope exists, but it's conditional, earned, grounded. People plan for things to go wrong and celebrate when they don't. That mindset produces fewer miracles and more survivals. Again, survival doesn't make a good headline unless it fails. The state's relationship with pride is subtle. Pride isn't declared, it's implied. You won't hear people constantly praising Kentucky, but you'll hear them defend it the moment someone else crosses a line. That defensive pride isn't about image, it's about ownership. You can criticize your family, outsiders can't. That line is clear even if it's never spoken. Kentucky also exists in a cultural blind spot because it doesn't neatly fit political storytelling. It's not fully rural, not fully urban, not purely Southern, not fully Midwestern. That ambiguity makes it inconvenient. Narratives prefer clean categories. Kentucky refuses them. It lives in the overlap, borrowing pieces from multiple identities without committing fully to any of them. That hybridity makes it hard to package and easy to ignore. And then there's the generational humor that runs through everything. A kind of dry absurdism shaped by living in a place constantly underestimated. People joke because the alternative is frustration. They joke because irony feels safer than anger. That humor carries wisdom disguised as sarcasm. It teaches you how to navigate a world that doesn't quite see you. Laugh first, explain later, or don't explain at all. The idea of zero to hero plays out differently in Kentucky too. Heroism isn't about dramatic ascents. It's about consistency, showing up for decades, keeping something alive when it would be easier to quit, passing knowledge quietly, protecting land, family, skills, traditions without announcing it. That kind of heroism doesn't get statues. It gets continuity. Kentucky's future will likely look like its past in one crucial way. It will be underestimated until after it matters. New industries will appear quietly. Cultural shifts will mature before being noticed. People will leave, return, and reshape things again. The state won't suddenly become unforgettable. It will remain familiar enough to ignore and important enough to matter. And that's the paradox. Forgettability becomes a shield. It allows experimentation without pressure. It allows authenticity without branding. It allows failure without spectacle. Kentucky operates in that protected space, using invisibility as insulation. So when someone struggles to remember Kentucky on a list of 50 states, it's not proof of irrelevance. It's evidence of a different survival strategy, one that prioritizes durability over dominance, substance over signal, presence over performance. Kentucky doesn't ask to be remembered. It assumes it will be there whether you remember it or not. And history suggests it's right. Kentucky's identity is also built on layers that are easy to overlook because they don't shout for attention. Geography is deceptively gentle. The hills, rivers, and valleys aren't jagged or dramatic in the way that mountain ranges or canyons are. They roll and fold, creating spaces that feel familiar without startling. That familiarity contributes to the state's invisibility. People drive through, glance at the scenery, and move on, assuming they know it when in reality, they barely scratch the surface. Ha ha ha. The agricultural backbone of Kentucky reinforces this subtlety. Tobacco, corn, soybeans, and of course, horse farms create a patchwork landscape that looks static but is constantly in motion. Seasons dictate activity: planting, tending, harvesting. The rhythm is slow, predictable, and essential, yet it fails to generate the kind of spectacle that sticks in memory. Those who work these lands know the value of patience and resilience, skills that translate into other areas of life. Outsiders often miss the quiet mastery involved. Then there's the bourbon industry, iconic yet misunderstood. Bourbon isn't just whiskey, it's a culture, an economy, a timeline. Barrels age for years, quietly interacting with the wood, temperature, and air. It's a slow process of perfection. The state's identity is reflected here. patient, methodical, and unglamorous to those who only see the end product. People outside Kentucky taste the whiskey, not the decades of process that produced it. Similarly, Kentucky itself is experienced superficially by many Americans, passing through, glancing, then forgetting. Music, too, is a silent thread in Kentucky's story. Bluegrass, country, gospel, and Appalachian folk coexist and evolve in local communities. The music doesn't always leave the state's borders, yet it shapes the country. Musicians absorb local stories, landscapes, and culture, exporting it subtly through their art. Unlike pop hits that demand instant attention, Kentucky music seeps in slowly, influencing in ways that aren't always visible or recognized. Kentucky's social structure is another layer of invisibility. Communities are tightly knit. Families interweave over generations, forming networks of support, expectation, and accountability. Outsiders often interpret this as insularity, but it's a survival mechanism. People here understand the value of continuity and long-term investment in relationships. It's subtle. It's powerful. It goes unnoticed because it doesn't dramatize itself. Even Kentucky's struggles with poverty and economic shifts are absorbed differently. While national media might portray decline in extremes, locals approach it with pragmatism. Resourcefulness is required, solutions are incremental, and failure is managed privately. This reality-building mindset reinforces the state's invisibility. It doesn't make headlines, yet it quietly maintains stability and resilience. Kentucky's educational culture adds another nuance. Schools serve as community hubs, often performing multiple social roles. Teachers multitask and innovate not because of recognition, but necessity. Knowledge dissemination prioritizes functionality, skills for life, adaptability, and resilience. Graduates carry these lessons outward, influencing the broader country even if their origin goes unacknowledged. Sports and community identity are inseparable. College basketball, horse racing, and local leagues function as communal glue. Allegiance is inherited and experienced, not performative. The passion is intense, but because it exists in small, localized ecosystems, outsiders rarely grasp its depth. It contributes to Kentucky's paradox: intense engagement with locals, yet invisibility to the broader public. The state's resilience through natural disasters is similarly understated. Floods, tornadoes, and economic shifts have tested communities repeatedly. Response isn't about headlines. It's practical, communal, and immediate. Lives are stabilized without spectacle, and problems are solved without national attention. Outsiders see results only in passing statistics, never in the human networks and daily effort required. Kentucky's contradictions, rural and urban, traditional and innovative, proud and humble, exist side by side without tension. They coexist because the culture values functionality over image. Outsiders misread subtlety as monotony, yet it's this balance that underpins survival, continuity, and authenticity. All these factors converge to explain why Kentucky is so often forgotten in surveys and casual recollection. Forgettability isn't failure, it's a strategy. Kentucky survives invisibly, shapes culture subtly, and nurtures resilience quietly. The state doesn't need applause. It doesn't chase attention. It doesn't dramatize. It simply exists, influencing without demanding recognition, stabilizing without declaration, and enduring without spectacle. That's the full essence of Kentucky. Kentucky's history is another layer that often goes unnoticed, yet it profoundly shapes its present identity. From pre-colonial times, indigenous peoples traversed and lived in these rolling hills and river valleys, establishing paths and settlements that would later influence roads, towns, and land use. European settlement brought waves of migration, mostly from the Upper South and Appalachia, blending cultures, skills, and traditions. The state's geography made large-scale urbanization difficult, so communities developed slowly, fostering interdependence and local identity over outward recognition. The Civil War era adds complexity. Kentucky's position as a border state created political tension, divided loyalties, and internal conflicts that lasted long after battles ceased. Families were split, towns were ambivalent, and allegiances shifted depending on immediate survival rather than ideology. This historical nuance isn't easily packaged in national narratives, which prefer simple sides, heroes, and villains. Kentucky's reality was messy, gray, and human, which makes it harder to remember in shorthand history lessons. Post-Civil War, Kentucky's economy relied on agriculture, mining, and later manufacturing, but each sector developed unevenly. Industrialization reached certain cities while leaving rural areas relatively untouched. This created a patchwork of opportunity, shaping social mobility and migration patterns. People moved to Louisville or Lexington for work, but many stayed on family land, balancing modern opportunity with tradition. The duality continues today, contributing to a cultural richness that outsiders often overlook. The bourbon industry deserves deeper scrutiny because it exemplifies Kentucky's approach to legacy and subtle influence. Distillers learned to manipulate time, temperature, and wood interactions to create products that were both consistent and unique. The process requires patience, attention, and quiet expertise. The resulting influence extends beyond the state. Bourbon became synonymous with American identity abroad, yet most consumers don't realize the subtlety behind each barrel. The metaphor for Kentucky itself is obvious: influence without overt spectacle. Horse farms, especially in Lexington and the Bluegrass region, provide another overlooked aspect. These farms aren't just about racing or luxury. They represent centuries of land stewardship, breeding expertise, and economic ecosystem development. Maintaining such farms requires knowledge of soil, climate, animal husbandry, and business, skills passed down through generations. Outsiders often see spectacle, derby hats, jockeys, racetrack excitement, without noticing the deep, consistent expertise sustaining it behind the scenes. Cultural contributions are also subtle yet significant. Kentucky produces writers, musicians, and artists who quietly shape national and international trends. Think of bluegrass legends, literary voices, or painters whose influence seeps into broader aesthetics. Their Kentucky identity informs their work, but the state itself rarely receives recognition. The influence is real, but the attribution is often missing. Ha ha ha. Migration patterns highlight another aspect of Kentucky's quiet influence. Many leave seeking education, career opportunities, or broader horizons, only to carry Kentucky's values: resilience, practicality, humor, adaptability into new communities. Return migration introduces new skills, ideas, and perspectives, gradually reshaping local culture. The cycle perpetuates a kind of invisible reinforcement. Kentucky's influence radiates outward without needing to be noticed. Even folklore and local storytelling contribute to identity and visibility. Myths, legends, and regional anecdotes preserve community memory, cultural norms, and ethical lessons. They're often private, oral traditions that outsiders rarely witness. Yet they shape attitudes, humor, and decision-making subtly, embedding Kentucky's character into its residents without national acknowledgement. Economically, Kentucky functions like connective tissue. Logistics hubs in Louisville move goods across the country. Agricultural products feed multiple regions. Bourbon, horses, and manufacturing extend influence far beyond state lines. Yet the state itself remains in the background. Its contribution is systemic, necessary, and invisible. This invisibility is not failure, it's function. In education, Kentucky demonstrates similar subtle mastery. Schools double as community centers. Teachers juggle multiple responsibilities. Curricula often balance traditional academics with practical skills. Students grow up learning adaptability, resilience, and problem-solving organically. These qualities manifest nationally when graduates relocate, influencing workplaces, communities, and industries without explicit acknowledgement. The juxtaposition of rural and urban Kentucky also reinforces its paradoxical invisibility. Cities like Louisville, Lexington, and Bowling Green pulse with cultural, economic, and educational activity, yet they remain smaller and quieter than coastal metropolises. Rural areas maintain traditions, agricultural expertise, and localized social networks. This balance ensures functionality without spectacle. contributing to a state identity that's both influential and easily overlooked. So in summary, Kentucky's invisibility is a byproduct of its depth. Geography, history, economy, culture, education, migration, and social networks all operate quietly, influencing beyond the state while resisting sensationalism. Forgettability is not a flaw. It is a deliberate, evolved feature. Kentucky endures, persists, and shapes quietly, precisely because it doesn't need attention to survive or succeed. Kentucky's towns themselves are a microcosm of the state's quiet influence and subtle complexity. Small towns are often overlooked in surveys or travel itineraries, yet they are where culture, memory, and daily life intersect. Streets are laid out not for spectacle but for function. Local businesses survive because of community loyalty, not flashy marketing. Schools, churches, and town halls serve as anchors, shaping social rhythms and decision-making processes. The state's influence is embedded in these structures, quiet, consistent, and foundational. Ha. River systems, particularly the Ohio, Kentucky, and Mississippi rivers, have shaped settlement, commerce, and culture for centuries. They are natural highways, historically enabling trade, migration, and economic growth. Communities along these rivers are strategically positioned, yet rarely recognized for their systemic importance. The rivers connect Kentucky to the broader nation, sustaining commerce and culture, all while the state itself remains background context in national consciousness. Local economies reflect resilience through diversity. Beyond bourbon, horses, and agriculture, Kentucky hosts emerging tech sectors, logistics, healthcare, and niche manufacturing. These industries adapt quietly to global trends, emphasizing sustainability and practicality over flash. Outsiders often perceive Kentucky as dependent on traditional industries, but the state continuously experiments, innovates, and adapts without demanding national attention. Dialects and language patterns further reflect Kentucky's nuanced identity. Speech rhythms, vocabulary, and idioms encode regional history, migration patterns, and social networks. Outsiders hear accents or colloquialisms and reduce them to stereotypes, missing their rich cultural significance. Language preserves community cohesion and identity across generations, subtly reinforcing Kentucky's influence even when overlooked. Traditions, from local festivals to foodways, offer insight into Kentucky's deep-rooted cultural literacy. Festivals celebrate harvests, horses, music, or heritage, but rarely make national headlines. Food, likewise, prioritizes functionality and community. Fried chicken, bourbon-infused recipes, cornbread, and locally sourced produce reflect practicality, taste, and communal values rather than performative extravagance. These traditions endure across generations, quietly embedding Kentucky's ethos into daily life. Transportation infrastructure is another overlooked facet. Interstates like I-75, I-64, and aren't just highways. They're circulatory systems for commerce, migration, and cultural exchange. They position Kentucky as a central corridor for the eastern United States. Millions pass through annually, contributing to national mobility, yet most travelers experience Kentucky as a transient backdrop, hardly aware of its systemic contribution. Kentucky's demographic dynamics also reinforce its invisibility. Population density is moderate. Urban centers are balanced by rural expanses. Migration patterns, both in and out, create dynamic cultural exchange while keeping the state's identity cohesive. People carry Kentucky's values elsewhere, exporting resilience, humor, and pragmatism while the state itself remains quietly influential. Folklore, storytelling, and oral history perpetuate identity in ways academics and survey takers often ignore. Myths of the Appalachian Hills, horse racing legends, local ghost stories, and historical anecdotes embed moral, practical, and social codes. This cultural transmission operates under the radar of mainstream memory, yet shapes perceptions, behaviors, and creative output both inside and beyond the state. Kentucky's environmental diversity further contributes to its layered identity. From the rolling bluegrass pastures to the Appalachian forests, wetlands, and river valleys, ecosystems provide both economic and cultural resources. Conservation efforts, hunting traditions, and outdoor recreation are interwoven with daily life, fostering ecological literacy and community cohesion. These aspects rarely reach national awareness, but define much of Kentucky's lived experience. Religion, often understated in national portrayals, informs social networks, communal practices, and ethical frameworks. Churches serve multiple roles: spiritual centers, community hubs, disaster response coordinators, and cultural preserver. Faith here is functional and embedded rather than performative, influencing behavior and priorities subtly yet profoundly. Finally, Kentucky's response to change, economic, environmental, or cultural, is measured and pragmatic. It doesn't chase trends or external validation. It observes, adapts, and integrates change without theatrics. This quiet mastery ensures resilience and continuity, making Kentucky a stabilizing force that rarely appears in surveys, media, or memory exercises. Ha ha ha. In essence, Kentucky's forgettability is the result of persistent depth, systemic influence, and subtlety. Geography, infrastructure, economy, culture, language, history, ecology, and social networks all function cohesively, shaping both residents and outsiders without demanding recognition. Forgettability is not neglect, it is a feature. Kentucky persists, impacts, and evolves, quietly proving that the most important things don't always need attention to matter. Kentucky's daily life reflects its unique blend of tradition, resilience, and quiet influence. Days begin early in rural areas, often with agricultural work or preparation for small businesses. People rely on routines built over generations, honed to maximize efficiency and sustainability. Even urban areas mirror this ethos. Schedules are practical, social interactions deliberate, and community engagement consistent. There's a rhythm to life here that outsiders rarely perceive, a cadence that balances work, family, and culture seamlessly. Ha ha ha. Local microeconomics illustrate how resourcefulness defines Kentucky's culture. Small farms, artisans, and family-owned shops operate on adaptive models. They adjust pricing, products, and services based on community needs rather than mass-market trends. This approach fosters resilience, ensures long-term sustainability, and builds loyalty. Outsiders might see this as small-scale or stagnant, but it's a sophisticated system optimized for stability, social cohesion, and slow growth. Kentucky's psychological patterns are equally fascinating. Residents develop acute awareness of systems, social, economic, and environmental, because misreading them has consequences. Humor, patience, and observation are survival tools as much as cultural markers. People learn to navigate ambiguity, skepticism, and contradiction from a young age, giving them an adaptability that translates into work, education, and relationships elsewhere. This cognitive subtlety contributes to the state's influence outside its borders, often without explicit recognition. Historical anecdotes add layers of texture. For example, the development of the Louisville and Nashville Railroad shaped economic corridors, migration, and urbanization patterns that still affect modern transport and commerce. Horse racing traditions trace back centuries, influencing land use, breeding techniques, and even international perceptions of Kentucky as a center of equine excellence. Bourbon distilleries survive Prohibition-era loopholes, resource constraints, and market fluctuations, demonstrating innovation embedded in heritage. Each anecdote, mundane or legendary, contributes to Kentucky's invisible resilience. Kentucky's festivals and public events further reflect its subtle cultural impact. Local fairs, bluegrass gatherings, horse shows, and harvest celebrations combine social cohesion with economic activity. Participation is voluntary, engagement is genuine, and knowledge is transmitted through experience rather than spectacle. Outsiders may see only quaint or regional traditions, but these events reinforce identity, intergenerational knowledge, and community networks crucial to maintaining social fabric. Transportation systems illustrate another dimension of quiet influence. Interstate 75, Interstate 64, and other key routes form arteries that connect northern, southern, and eastern regions. Freight moves efficiently through Kentucky, supporting national supply chains. The state's logistics expertise is embedded in infrastructure, regulatory knowledge, and labor proficiency, impacting commerce far beyond its borders. Yet, travelers often perceive Kentucky merely as a corridor, ignoring its operational significance. Kentucky's culinary culture is both functional and expressive. Recipes emphasize practicality, resourcefulness, and taste. Fried chicken, burgoo, cornbread, bourbon-infused dishes, and farm-to-table produce reflect historical necessity and modern adaptation. Meals are designed for family, community, and sustenance over spectacle. Culinary skills transmit values: patience, adaptability, and respect for process. Outsiders may see comfort food. Residents see survival, heritage, and identity woven into every dish. Education serves multiple roles in daily life. Schools function as hubs for learning, community organization, and socialization. Teachers adapt creatively to local resources, often addressing gaps in infrastructure or opportunity with innovative solutions. Students develop practical skills, critical thinking, and social intelligence that translate beyond Kentucky. These educational patterns propagate influence quietly, as graduates carry Kentucky's problem-solving ethos to workplaces, communities, and industries nationally. Kentucky's migration patterns further enhance its subtle national impact. Residents leaving for education, careers, or opportunities carry cultural norms, work ethics, humor, and adaptability into new regions. Returnees often integrate broader perspectives while preserving local identity, catalyzing incremental modernization without erasing tradition. These flows maintain Kentucky's relevance while reinforcing its low-profile visibility, influence without recognition. The state's folklore, oral history, and storytelling traditions encode moral, social, and practical lessons. Tales of Appalachian spirits, horse racing legends, mining exploits, and pioneer resilience preserve intergenerational knowledge. These stories inform decision-making, humor, risk assessment, and creativity, embedding Kentucky's character into daily life subtly yet powerfully. Outsiders rarely perceive the depth behind these narratives, reinforcing the perception of forgettability. In conclusion, Kentucky's forgettable label belies its systemic, cultural, and historical significance. From daily routines and microeconomics to folklore, migration, and education, the state exerts influence quietly, persistently, and efficiently. Forgettability is not weakness. It is a strategy that ensures survival, resilience, and authentic cultural continuity. Kentucky persists, shapes, and thrives without demanding attention, an invisible backbone of American life. Kentucky's community microstructures are a study in subtle, efficient organization. Town councils, neighborhood associations, and informal community networks operate seamlessly without the fanfare seen in larger cities. Decision-making is pragmatic and often consensus-driven. Leaders gain authority not through charisma or media attention, but through consistent contribution and local knowledge. This creates a type of social stability rarely documented but critical to maintaining continuity. Outsiders might miss it entirely, yet these microstructures allow Kentucky towns to respond to crises, shifts in economy, and social challenges without chaos. Ha. Environmental adaptations further highlight the state's quiet ingenuity. Residents manage land, waterways, and natural resources with intimate knowledge of local ecosystems. Flood-prone areas are mitigated through historical land management practices. Agricultural methods are fine-tuned to soil and climate conditions, often passed down through generations. Hunting, fishing, and forest management are integrated into everyday life, serving both sustenance and cultural transmission. Outsiders often dismiss these adaptations as quaint or rudimentary, yet they reflect a deep ecological literacy. Intergenerational traditions reinforce community cohesion and identity. Kentucky families maintain long-held practices, passing down recipes, farm techniques, music, oral histories, and local lore. These traditions function as both practical knowledge and cultural reinforcement. They teach younger generations values like patience, respect, resourcefulness, and adaptability. The continuity of practice ensures that Kentucky's influence is not only present in daily life, but also sustained over time, even as individual residents migrate or industries shift. Psychological resilience is another cornerstone of Kentucky's identity. Residents navigate uncertainty, from economic fluctuations to natural disasters, by cultivating patience, strategic thinking, and humor. Problem solving is embedded in daily routines, repairing machinery, managing farms, balancing budgets, negotiating local conflicts. These experiences produce adaptive cognition that is transferred outward when Kentuckians move elsewhere, subtly influencing broader American society without overt recognition. The state's historical layers compound its subtle complexity. Pre-colonial paths, early settlements, Civil War allegiances, industrial shifts, and migration patterns all intersect to form a living cultural landscape. Unlike states that rely on monuments or national media to assert their identity, Kentucky preserves its history in functional structures: roadways, farms, town layouts, and family knowledge. Outsiders perceive only fragments, reinforcing the sense of forgettability while missing the state's depth. Kentucky's role in national infrastructure is often overlooked. Freight corridors, agricultural production, and distribution networks rely on the state's geographic position and operational knowledge. Louisville, as a logistics hub, exemplifies this. Billions of dollars in goods pass through annually, sustaining commerce across the eastern United States. Yet, travelers experience Kentucky mostly as a transit space, an invisible force sustaining mobility, efficiency, and economic stability. Cultural subtlety defines much of Kentucky's influence. Music, literature, and arts originate from deeply rooted local traditions. Bluegrass and Appalachian music, for instance, impact American music far beyond the state, yet the source is rarely acknowledged. Writers draw from Kentucky's landscapes, dialects, and social rhythms, influencing literature nationally while remaining rooted in local contexts. Visual arts, crafts, and performance traditions similarly reflect resilience, subtlety, and continuity. Religion and moral frameworks shape daily behavior without imposing external visibility. Churches serve as multifaceted institutions, centers of worship, community coordination, disaster response, and social cohesion. Faith informs ethics, work habits, and interpersonal dynamics, reinforcing stability and local networks. These systems operate quietly, rarely noticed by outsiders, yet they are integral to the state's cohesion and continuity. Kentucky's economic strategy emphasizes sustainability over spectacle. Small businesses, family farms, and emerging industries operate with long-term thinking. Innovation is applied to improve efficiency, resilience, and adaptability rather than to attract attention. This approach produces robust communities and industries, yet it escapes recognition in surveys, news, or casual memory. Forgettability is a byproduct of intentional, understated functionality. In sum, Kentucky thrives through quiet mastery across multiple dimensions: social, economic, environmental, cultural, historical, and psychological. Its residents embody adaptability, resourcefulness, humor, and patience. The state influences national systems, culture, and demographics while maintaining low visibility. Forgettability is not weakness, it is strategic endurance. Kentucky persists, grows, and shapes the country from the background, proving that influence does not require attention to matter. Kentucky's specific towns offer a fascinating glimpse into the state's micro-level identity. Take Lexington, for example, a city that balances urban sophistication with equestrian tradition. Streets lined with historic buildings coexist with state-of-the-art equine facilities. Horse farms encircle the city, shaping both the economy and the culture. Residents' daily lives intertwine with this equine heritage. Children may ride before school, business meetings can happen on farms, and festivals celebrate thoroughbred culture. The city exerts cultural influence beyond state lines, particularly in horse breeding and racing. Yet visitors often see only the racetrack glamour without understanding the decades of knowledge and community infrastructure that support it. Ha ha ha. Louisville, another cornerstone city, functions as both economic and logistical engine. UPS Worldport, one of the largest air freight hubs globally, operates here, meaning a vast portion of national and international commerce flows through the city daily. Yet, travelers passing through often see only highways, airport sprawl, and shopping districts. The city's influence is systemic. Freight, supply chains, and employment structures ripple far beyond Kentucky, while local visibility remains modest. Louisville's cultural footprint, music, arts, food, also travels outward subtly, shaping tastes and trends without overt branding. Bowling Green and Paducah illustrate how mid-sized cities integrate industry, education, and local culture. Bowling Green is home to manufacturing and automotive hubs, providing jobs and technical expertise that feed national production lines. Paducah's artistic community, centered on quilting and riverfront arts, preserves heritage while fostering innovation. These smaller cities maintain influence disproportionate to their size because they serve as hubs of knowledge, skill, and cultural preservation, even if the national eye overlooks them. Family legacies are another layer of Kentucky's subtle power. Multi-generational farms, small businesses, and artisanal crafts are often passed down without interruption. Skills, ethics, and networks are inherited alongside property and enterprises. Younger generations learn resilience, adaptability, and innovation within the context of local culture. Outsiders may see only continuity, failing to recognize the nuanced mentorship, embedded knowledge, and cumulative expertise that these legacies transmit. Local governance structures amplify Kentucky's quiet mastery. County governments, town councils, and informal neighborhood networks operate efficiently with minimal publicity. Leaders gain influence through consistency, knowledge, and tangible contribution rather than charisma or media presence. Policies are often incremental and pragmatic, addressing real needs rather than ideological agendas. This creates functional, resilient communities that weather economic, social, and environmental challenges quietly yet effectively. Ecological micromanagement is another often overlooked aspect. Residents employ sophisticated strategies to manage soil quality, water resources, forests, and agricultural output. Techniques may seem simple on the surface: rotating crops, maintaining pastures, controlling riverbank erosion, but these practices are grounded in centuries of observation and experimentation. Wildlife management, hunting, and sustainable forestry further reflect a population deeply attuned to its environment, creating both economic and ecological stability without public acknowledgement. Educational nuances reinforce Kentucky's subtle influence. Schools serve as cultural, social, and educational hubs. Teachers adapt creatively to limited resources, integrating practical skills alongside academics. Students grow up mastering problem-solving, critical thinking, and social navigation. The result is a population capable of contributing effectively both locally and nationally, transmitting Kentucky's values far beyond the state itself. Ha ha ha. Psychological patterns observed in Kentucky residents reveal resilience, pragmatism, and adaptability. Life experiences, ranging from navigating economic fluctuation to natural disasters, shape cognitive strategies, emotional regulation, and interpersonal skills. Humor often functions as a coping mechanism, patience as a survival skill, and observation as a tool for decision-making. These traits are subtle yet potent, and they influence communities beyond state borders as residents migrate or engage with broader society. Folklore, music, and storytelling preserve cultural knowledge and social norms. Local tales of pioneers, mining, horse racing, and regional myths encode moral and practical lessons. Music, particularly bluegrass, serves as both entertainment and education, transmitting values, history, and social cohesion. The influence of these traditions extends nationally, often unacknowledged, reinforcing the state's subtle power. Kentucky's intergenerational and systemic strategies collectively reinforce its paradoxical invisibility. The state's depth, resilience, and adaptability allow it to remain forgettable to surveys and casual memory, while simultaneously shaping commerce, culture, and community far beyond its borders. Forgettability is strategic, and influence persists quietly, demonstrating that visibility is not the measure of impact. Kentucky's micro-level interactions reveal a depth of social cohesion rarely acknowledged. Neighbors often rely on each other for practical support, sharing tools, helping with harvests, or assisting during natural events like floods or ice storms. This creates informal networks of trust and reciprocity that act as safety nets. Outsiders might dismiss these practices as quaint or redundant, but they function as adaptive systems, communities resilient to economic or environmental shocks. Ha ha ha. Town-by-town case studies highlight Kentucky's layered identity. Take Bardstown, often called the bourbon capital of the world. Its economy revolves around distilleries, tourism, and heritage preservation. Residents maintain centuries-old distilling techniques, local festivals, and historical architecture. Visitors see a charming town and taste bourbon, but few recognize the interwoven networks of education, craftsmanship, business acumen, and regulation that sustain this economy. The town's influence ripples nationally through both spirits and cultural perception. In contrast, Hazard in eastern Kentucky illustrates resilience under environmental and economic pressures. Historically reliant on coal mining, the town has adapted to industry decline by diversifying employment, focusing on education, healthcare, and small business development. Residents leverage social networks, local governance, and family legacies to navigate economic uncertainty. While Hazard might be invisible to national surveys, its practices showcase the resourcefulness, adaptability, and persistence that define Kentucky broadly. Rural ecological adaptations are subtle yet sophisticated. Farmers and landowners manage pastures, crop rotations, riverbanks, and forested areas using a combination of inherited knowledge and practical observation. Techniques for flood mitigation, soil fertility, and livestock management reflect generations of experimentation. Hunting, fishing, and small-scale forestry are integrated into community rhythms, sustaining both economy and culture. Outsiders see only picturesque landscapes. Locals see functioning, adaptive systems. Family and business networks reinforce Kentucky's influence. Multi-generational enterprises, farms, distilleries, craft workshops, and local shops combine legacy knowledge with ongoing innovation. Younger generations inherit both tangible assets and intangible skills: negotiation, problem-solving, ecological awareness, and cultural literacy. This creates continuity, resilience, and subtle economic influence that extends beyond state borders. Education and mentorship further amplify Kentucky's impact. Teachers, mentors, and community leaders integrate practical life skills with academics, creating residents capable of navigating both local and national environments effectively. Schools function as community hubs, reinforcing identity, transmitting values, and preserving knowledge while preparing students to influence broader society. Cultural continuity is reinforced through music, art, and folklore. Bluegrass, Appalachian storytelling, quilting, and local crafts transmit ethical codes, historical memory, and social cohesion. These practices are not performative, they are lived and embedded. The resulting cultural influence reaches far beyond Kentucky's borders, shaping American music, literature, and visual arts, often without explicit attribution. Ha ha ha. Psychological resilience manifests in everyday problem-solving. Residents cultivate patience, strategic thinking, and humor as mechanisms to navigate uncertainty, from fluctuating markets to natural disasters. Decision-making emphasizes observation, adaptability, and long-term outcomes. These cognitive patterns are transmitted generationally, influencing broader social systems when Kentuckians move or engage outside the state. Local governance emphasizes pragmatic solutions over spectacle. County commissions, municipal councils, and informal community groups focus on functional outcomes, prioritizing consensus and long-term stability. Leaders gain respect through consistent action, knowledge, and reliability rather than charisma. This results in stable communities capable of absorbing economic, environmental, and social shocks. Kentucky's invisibility in national memory surveys is thus a product of layered, systemic depth. Geography, economy, culture, education, folklore, psychological patterns, and governance interact to produce influence without visibility. Forgettability is not weakness. It is the product of resilience, subtlety, and systemic mastery. The state's impact reaches far beyond its borders, quietly shaping commerce, culture, and community nationwide. Kentucky's local governance structures are intricate and operate with quiet efficiency. County governments, city councils, and informal community committees balance responsibilities that range from infrastructure maintenance to public safety, economic development, and cultural preservation. Decisions are often incremental, focused on long-term sustainability rather than short-term visibility. Leaders gain authority through consistent results and deep local knowledge, rather than media attention or political theatrics. This system allows communities to respond rapidly to challenges, natural disasters, economic shifts, or social needs, without generating national headlines, further reinforcing the state's forgettable perception. Ha ha ha. Environmental systems in Kentucky demonstrate sophisticated adaptation. Residents manage river valleys, floodplains, and forested areas with knowledge accumulated over generations. Agricultural fields are rotated to maintain soil fertility. Pastures are maintained to balance livestock needs and ecosystem health. Riparian zones are carefully monitored to reduce erosion and manage water quality. Even small-scale interventions, such as contour plowing or selective tree planting, reflect deep ecological literacy. Outsiders may perceive Kentucky's landscape as simply scenic or pastoral, but in reality, it is a complex, managed system sustaining both economy and culture. Microeconomics at the local level reveals strategic ingenuity. Small farms, family-owned businesses, and artisanal workshops operate on adaptive models that respond to community needs, supply constraints, and market fluctuations. These enterprises emphasize resilience over scale. Pricing, production, and service decisions are often informed by intimate knowledge of consumer behavior and local culture. The result is an ecosystem that supports both livelihood and cultural continuity, while influencing larger economic systems indirectly. Intergenerational social practices reinforce cohesion and continuity. Families pass down skills, knowledge, and values, farming techniques, craft skills, ethical frameworks, humor, and storytelling traditions. These transfers ensure that essential survival skills, cultural identity, and adaptive strategies are preserved across generations. When younger generations migrate for education or work, they carry these embedded skills and cultural frameworks with them, subtly influencing communities outside Kentucky. Educational systems double as social infrastructure. Schools are more than places of academic instruction. They serve as hubs for cultural transmission, mentorship, and community organization. Teachers integrate practical skills with academics, ensuring students are prepared for both local realities and broader opportunities. Educational institutions propagate resilience, problem-solving, and adaptability across generations, amplifying Kentucky's impact quietly but significantly. Psychological resilience permeates everyday life. Residents develop patience, strategic thinking, and adaptive problem-solving through experiences with fluctuating markets, environmental hazards, and social dynamics. Humor functions as both a coping mechanism and social lubricant. Observational skills, critical thinking, and long-term planning are reinforced through daily routines, creating residents capable of navigating complex systems with minimal guidance. These traits propagate outward as residents engage nationally, further extending Kentucky's subtle influence. Cultural continuity manifests in music, arts, and folklore. Bluegrass, Appalachian storytelling, quilting, and craftwork encode moral, social, and practical lessons. These traditions are lived and experienced rather than broadcasted, yet they ripple through broader culture. Musicians, writers, and artists carrying Kentucky's influence shape American arts and literature subtly, often without recognition of the source. Ha ha ha. Kentucky's daily life integrates all these elements seamlessly. Families, schools, towns, and ecological systems interact in ways that maintain both resilience and continuity. Decisions, routines, and social interactions are informed by centuries of accumulated knowledge, producing a system that functions efficiently and quietly. Visitors often perceive only surface-level charm or scenic beauty, missing the complex interplay of systems sustaining the state's culture, economy, and social fabric. This depth of systemic integration explains why Kentucky is frequently forgotten in memory surveys. Its influence is embedded in networks, routines, and systems rather than dramatic spectacle. Forgettability is not neglect, it is strategic resilience. Kentucky shapes commerce, culture, and community far beyond its borders while maintaining low visibility, proving that influence does not require attention to matter. Kentucky's towns each offer unique windows into the state's systemic subtlety and enduring influence. Take Elizabethtown, a small city with historical roots that intersect with transportation, commerce, and local governance. Its location along key highways and rivers allows it to serve as a hub for trade and movement, yet most travelers pass through without noticing the infrastructure, community planning, and economic coordination that sustain it. Local schools, businesses, and civic organizations operate quietly, transmitting skills, ethics, and knowledge from generation to generation, embedding Kentucky's subtle influence into everyday life. Ha ha ha. Georgetown provides another case study of systemic integration. It is home to manufacturing, equestrian industries, and educational institutions. The presence of the Toyota manufacturing plant is an example of global economic influence occurring quietly within the state. Supply chains, workforce development, and logistics expertise all converge here, producing impact far beyond Kentucky's borders, while most people remain unaware of its significance. Local culture remains intertwined with global industry. Horse farms, community events, and historic districts coexist alongside international business operations, producing a seamless blend of heritage and modernity. Family networks are critical to understanding Kentucky's deep social fabric. Generations maintain farms, craft businesses, distilleries, and local enterprises. Skills, knowledge, and ethics are transmitted through daily practice rather than formal instruction. Young people learn negotiation, resource management, social cohesion, and cultural literacy organically. These networks create resilient communities and contribute to broader regional and national influence as Kentuckians migrate, start businesses, or participate in governance beyond state borders. Small towns like Berea illustrate how education and arts reinforce identity. Berea College emphasizes community, cultural preservation, and practical education. Artisanship, craft traditions, and local culture are integrated into educational curricula, ensuring continuity of both skills and social values. Graduates carry these competencies nationally, influencing arts, crafts, and community practices while the source, Kentucky, remains subtly invisible. Environmental micromanagement continues to define life across Kentucky. Residents adapt to seasonal variations, river flooding, and soil management with techniques accumulated over centuries. Crop rotation, controlled grazing, selective forestry, and waterway management are standard practices, supporting both economic output and ecological health. Hunting and fishing traditions supplement subsistence while reinforcing ecological knowledge and cultural continuity. Visitors often see only scenic landscapes, missing the complex, adaptive systems in play. Transportation corridors like Interstates 75, 64, and 65 function as veins of national commerce. Freight and passenger flow through Kentucky continuously, connecting northern, southern, and eastern regions. The logistical expertise embedded in local planning, labor skills, and infrastructure maintenance ensures efficiency, yet travelers perceive Kentucky merely as a pass-through state. This invisibility masks systemic importance while reinforcing forgettability. Cultural continuity through music, folklore, and arts preserves social norms and ethical frameworks. Bluegrass, Appalachian storytelling, quilting, and craftwork encode historical memory, practical lessons, and moral guidance. These traditions function outside mass media or national attention, yet their influence propagates across the country through artists, musicians, and writers, subtly shaping broader American culture. Ha ha ha. Psychological resilience is embedded in daily routines. Residents develop patience, observation, strategic thinking, and humor as mechanisms to navigate uncertainty in economic, social, and environmental contexts. These cognitive and social skills are internalized from childhood and reinforced through community participation, creating a population capable of adaptability and subtle influence beyond the state. Okay, now bye-bye, see you soon. Come back tomorrow. Bye.